Hello there, and welcome to Sleep Orion. Tonight, we travel to the frozen heart of Antarctica, to a moment in human history when planning, precision, and partnership between man and animal achieved what seemed impossible: the conquest of the South Pole. In December of 1911, 5 men and their dog team stood at the bottom of the world, where every direction points north, where the ice beneath them was miles deep, and where the temperature could freeze a man's breath into crystals before it left his lips. They had traveled nearly 2,000 miles across a landscape that had defeated others, that had claimed lives, and that offered no mercy to those unprepared. This was not a story of luck. This was not a tale of daring improvisation or heroic suffering. This was the result of meticulous planning, years of experience, and an understanding that in the polar regions, the difference between triumph and tragedy is measured in ounces of food, minutes of daylight, and the strength of the dogs who pull your sledge through the endless white. Before we begin this journey, if you find peace in these quiet explorations of human endeavor and natural wonder, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, or leave a thought in the comments below. It helps others discover these stories, one sleepy soul at a time. For now, settle in. Let the outside world fade away. And join me as we follow the tracks of Roald Amundsen and his team across the Great Ice Barrier, up unnamed glacier, and onto the polar plateau itself. Let us begin. Roald Engelbrekt Gravening Amundsen was born on July 16, 1872, in the small town of Borge, near what would become Oslo, Norway. He was the 4th son of a ship owner and ship captain, born into a family where the sea was not merely a profession but a way of life. Yet young Roald's dreams reached beyond the familiar waters of the Norwegian coast. His eyes turned to the places on the map that remained blank, the regions where ice ruled and few dared to venture. At the age of 15, Amundsen read about Sir John Franklin's doomed expedition to find the Northwest Passage. While the tragedy should have served as warning, it instead ignited something within him. He later wrote that it was the suffering, the hardship, the battle against nature's most extreme forces that called to him. Here was a young man who saw in polar exploration not glory for its own sake, but a test of human capability, preparation, and will. His mother had different plans. She wished for him to become a doctor, a respectable profession that would keep him safe and prosperous. Dutifully, Amundsen enrolled in medical studies at Christiania University. But his heart was never in the lecture halls. At night, he would sleep with his windows open, even in the harsh Norwegian winters, conditioning his body to withstand cold. He took to the mountains, skiing across the desolate Hardangervidda plateau, teaching himself navigation, self-sufficiency, and endurance. When his mother died in 1893, Amundsen was 21 years old. He abandoned his medical studies without hesitation and signed aboard the Sela Magdalena for a voyage to the Arctic. It was his first taste of polar waters, and he took to it as if he had been born for nothing else. He absorbed everything. He learned seamanship, ice navigation, the behavior of pack ice, the techniques of hunting in frozen seas. Within a few years, he had qualified as a second mate, but more importantly, he had found his calling. In 1897, opportunity arrived in the form of the Belgian Antarctic expedition, led by Adrian de Gerlache aboard the ship Belgica. Amundsen signed on as first mate. This expedition would become his education in what not to do in polar regions. The Belgica became trapped in pack ice in the Bellingshausen Sea and was held fast through the entire Antarctic winter. It was the first expedition to winter in Antarctic waters, and it was a nightmare. The crew suffered from scurvy, depression, and near starvation. Several men descended into madness in the endless darkness and bitter cold. But Amundsen observed everything. While others despaired, he studied. He noted how inadequate their clothing was, how poor their diet proved to be, how lack of preparation for the psychological toll of polar night broke men's spirits. The ship's doctor, Frederick Cook, advocated for eating fresh seal meat to prevent scurvy, though the mechanism of vitamin C was not yet understood. Amundsen watched and remembered. He saw men waste away on preserved foods while those who ate fresh meat remained healthier. He observed that wool clothing became useless when wet, that proper ventilation in sleeping quarters mattered, that routine and purposeful activity during the long darkness kept men sane. When Belgica finally broke free and returned to civilization in 1899, Amundsen was no longer a naive sailor. He had survived what broke other men, and more importantly, he had learned from their mistakes. He now understood that polar exploration was not about courage alone. It was about preparation, about understanding the environment, about respecting the power of cold and ice and distance. His next goal was the Northwest Passage, the fabled sea route through the Arctic archipelago of northern Canada. Countless expeditions had attempted it for centuries. Most had failed. Many had died. But Amundsen approached it not as a conquest but as a problem to be solved through careful planning and the right equipment. He acquired a small, sturdy sloop called Gojo, specifically built for ice navigation. He recruited a crew of just 6 men, enough to sail the ship but small enough to reduce provisions needed. Most crucially, Amundsen studied the indigenous peoples of the Arctic. During his time on the Northwest Passage expedition, which lasted from 1903 to 1906, he lived among the Netsilik Inuit. He learned their language, wore their clothing, adopted their techniques for travel and survival. He learned how to drive dog sleds, how to construct igloos, how to hunt seals, how to navigate by stars and ice formations. These were not primitive people, as Europeans often assumed, but highly sophisticated survivors who had mastered one of Earth's harshest environments through thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. The Inuit taught him that the key to Arctic travel was not fighting the environment but adapting to it. Wear fur, not wool. Use dogs, not men or horses, to pull sleds. Eat fresh meat, especially organ meat. Travel when conditions allow, rest when they do not. Mark your route so you can find your way back. These lessons would prove invaluable. When Gojo finally emerged from the Northwest Passage in 1906, Amundsen became an international celebrity. At age 34, he had succeeded where hundreds before him had failed. Norway, which had only gained independence from Sweden the year before, celebrated him as a national hero. He was the man who had conquered the Northwest Passage, and his name was spoken alongside Nansen, his countryman and the greatest polar explorer of the previous generation. But Amundsen was not satisfied. His next goal was the North Pole itself. He approached Fridtjof Nansen, who generously offered the use of Fram, the ship specifically designed to withstand being frozen into pack ice. Amundsen's plan was to enter the Arctic Ocean via the Bering Strait and allow the ship to drift with the ice across the pole, just as Nansen had attempted years before. He spent years raising funds, securing equipment, and planning every detail of what would be a multi-year drift through the frozen Arctic Ocean. And then, in September 1909, everything changed. News broke that both Frederick Cook and Robert Peary claimed to have reached the North Pole, Cook in April 1908 and Peary in April 1909. The claims were disputed, controversial, and remain debated to this day. But the impact on Amundsen's plans was immediate and devastating. Whether the claims were true or not, the public believed the North Pole had been conquered. Funding for Amundsen's own North Pole expedition dried up almost overnight. No one wanted to finance a journey to a place already reached. Amundsen faced ruin. He had mortgaged his house, taken on debt, made promises to backers and crew. The expedition was already too far along to simply cancel. But going north now seemed pointless. He needed a new goal, something that would capture public imagination and justify the resources already invested. His eyes turned south. Antarctica. and specifically, the one great prize of polar exploration that remained unclaimed, the geographic South Pole. Ernest Shackleton had come agonizingly close in 1909, reaching 88 degrees 23 minutes south, just 97 nautical miles from the pole, before turning back due to lack of supplies. Robert Falcon Scott had announced his intention to mount another British expedition to claim the prize. Amundsen made his decision. He would race Scott to the South Pole. But he told almost no one. He confided only in his brother Leon, who managed the expedition's finances, and his second-in-command, Lieutenant Thorvald Nilsen. He did not tell his crew. He did not tell his backers. He did not tell the Norwegian government or even Nansen, from whom he had borrowed Fram. He knew that many would object, that they might try to stop him, that they would question the ethics of competing with Scott when the British had been planning their expedition openly for months. But Amundsen was not interested in fair play or sporting conduct. He was interested in success. And he believed, based on everything he had learned in 2 decades of polar experience, that he knew how to reach the South Pole and return safely. More importantly, he knew that his methods, his equipment, and his choice of dogs over ponies gave him a decisive advantage over the British approach. The stage was set. The Fram sailed from Norway on June 3, 1910, ostensibly bound for the Arctic. Only when they reached Madeira did Amundsen finally reveal the truth to his crew. They were going south. They were going to Antarctica. And they were going to be first to the South Pole. To a man, the crew agreed to follow him. They trusted Amundsen, trusted his experience, and trusted his planning. Some were excited by the prospect. Others were apprehensive. But all understood that they were about to participate in one of the great races of human exploration. Amundsen also sent a telegram from Madeira to Scott's ship, which was en route to Australia. The message was brief: beg leave to inform you Fram proceeding Antarctic. That was all. No apology, no explanation. Just a statement of fact. The race was on, though Scott would not learn of it until he reached Melbourne weeks later. When he did, he was reportedly furious, calling Amundsen's secrecy unsporting and underhanded. But in the realm of polar exploration, there were no rules of engagement, no referees. There was only the ice, the cold, and the goal. The ship Fram was unlike any vessel that had sailed before. Built between 1891 and 1893 specifically for Fridtjof Nansen's Arctic drift expedition, she had been designed by Colin Archer, Norway's leading naval architect and shipbuilder, to survive conditions that would crush ordinary ships. Her name meant forward in Norwegian, and everything about her construction reflected a single purpose: to withstand the immense pressures of pack ice. Fram's hull was rounded, almost bowl-shaped, with sides that sloped outward. When ice closed in around her, instead of being crushed as other ships would be, she would be lifted up, squeezed upward by the pressure like a pip from an orange. Nansen had described it as enabling the ship to slip like an eel out of the embraces of the ice. Her hull was built of layers of the hardest woods available, including greenheart from South America, and was reinforced with massive crossbeams and braces throughout her length. She was not a beautiful ship by conventional standards. Her beam of 36 feet in relation to her overall length of 128 feet gave her a stubby, inelegant appearance. In open water, she wallowed and rolled uncomfortably. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that she could survive being frozen into ice for years at a time, providing shelter and security for her crew in the most hostile environment on Earth. After Nansen's expedition ended, Fram had been used by Otto Sverdrup for 4 years of exploration in the Canadian Arctic, charting more than 100,000 square miles of previously unknown territory. She had proven herself repeatedly. By 1910, she sat idle in Oslo, technically the property of the Norwegian state but acknowledged as being Nansen's to use if he wished. When Amundsen approached him, Nansen generously agreed to loan the ship. Though Nansen had dreamed of taking Fram to Antarctica himself, those plans had faded, and he was willing to pass the torch to the younger explorer. Amundsen knew the ship's capabilities and limitations. Fram could reach Antarctica and serve as their base while establishing a shore camp. But once the shore party was landed, she would sail away to conduct oceanographic work, leaving the men alone on the ice for a full year before returning to collect them. This meant that everything needed for the polar journey had to be brought in that first landing. There would be no resupply, no backup, no rescue if things went wrong. The planning had to be perfect. Amundsen spent months studying previous Antarctic expeditions. He read Shackletow's account obsessively, noting where the British explorer had succeeded and where he had failed. Shackletow had relied primarily on Manchurian ponies for transport, supplemented by some dog teams. The ponies had performed poorly in the extreme cold, suffering terribly and eventually dying one by one as the expedition progressed. Shackletow had been forced to manhaul his sledges for the final push toward the pole, with the men themselves harnessed like beasts of burden, pulling hundreds of pounds across the ice. Scott was planning to use a combination of motor sledges, ponies, and dogs, with manhauling as a backup. Amundsen saw the fatal flaws in this approach. Motor sledges might work on firm, flat surfaces, but Antarctica's terrain was anything but predictable. Ponies were not adapted to extreme cold, they required enormous amounts of fodder that added to the expedition's weight, and their hooves broke through snow crust where dogs' paws would not. As for manhauling, it was a British tradition born of naval discipline and a certain pride in human endurance, but it was also staggeringly inefficient. Men pulling sledges burned thousands of calories per day, required massive food supplies, moved slowly, and broke down under the strain. Dogs, Amundsen knew from his Arctic experience, were the answer. Properly trained sledge dogs could travel 30 miles in a day with rest stops. They could navigate broken ice and deep snow that would stop ponies or motor vehicles. They required less food per unit of pulling power than any other alternative. They could withstand temperatures that killed horses. And crucially, in an emergency, they could be eaten, providing fresh meat that would prevent scurvy and supply calories for the men. It was a grim calculation, but Amundsen was a pragmatist. In the polar regions, sentimentality was a luxury no one could afford. He ordered 97 Greenland dogs, specifically selecting the best specimens from northern Greenland where the breed was strongest and most resilient. These were not pets or companions in the conventional sense. They were working animals, bred for thousands of years by the Inuit to pull heavy loads across sea ice and frozen tundra. They had thick double coats, powerful shoulders and legs, broad paws that distributed weight like snowshoes, and an innate endurance that allowed them to work day after day in conditions that would kill most other animals. The dogs would be Amundsen's secret weapon. While Scott was bringing ponies and experimental motor sledges, Amundsen was bringing the one form of transport proven over millennia of Arctic use. It was not romantic or particularly British, but it worked. And in the end, working was all that mattered. The choice of landing site was equally crucial. Shackletow and Scott had both established their bases at McMurdo Sound, on the western side of the Ross Ice Shelf. It was a logical choice in many ways, offering protection from the worst storms and relatively easy access to land. But it was also approximately 60 nautical miles farther from the pole than the Bay of Whales, an inlet on the Ross Ice Shelf itself. Shackletow had considered the Bay of Whales but rejected it, believing the ice there was unstable and might break off, carrying any camp built on it out to sea. But Amundsen studied the records carefully and came to a different conclusion. The ice in the Bay of Whales appeared to be grounded on underwater shoals or skerries, making it stable enough for his purposes. More importantly, those 60 miles represented a significant advantage. Every mile saved on the journey to the pole was a mile less strain on men and dogs, less food consumed, less fuel burned, less opportunity for something to go wrong. It was a calculated risk, but Amundsen was confident in his analysis. The Bay of Whales would be his starting point, putting him nearly a degree of latitude closer to his goal than Scott before either expedition even began moving inland. An expedition to the South Pole was only as strong as its weakest member. Amundsen understood this from his time on Belgica, where personality conflicts and incompatibility had magnified the already severe hardships of Antarctic isolation. For his own expedition, he needed men who were not only skilled but also psychologically stable, adaptable, and able to work together in the most stressful conditions imaginable. The crew of Fram would number 19 for the ocean voyage, but only 9 would form the shore party that would winter at the base in Antarctica, and only 5 would ultimately make the journey to the pole itself. Choosing these men required careful judgment. Amundsen looked for specific qualities: experience in cold climates, physical endurance, practical skills, the ability to work independently when necessary and cooperatively when required, and most importantly, a personality that would not crack under the strain of isolation, darkness, and proximity to death. For his officers, Amundsen selected naval lieutenants who brought both discipline and competence. Thorvald Nilsen would serve as second-in-command and captain of Fram during the ocean voyage and while the ship conducted scientific work. He was steady, reliable, and capable of managing the ship and its crew during the months they would be separated from the shore party. Christian Prestrud and Hjalmar Fredrik Gjertsen were the other 2 lieutenants. Despite having no medical training, Gjertsen was assigned as expedition doctor and sent on an intensive crash course in surgery and dentistry before departure. It was typical of Amundsen's pragmatic approach that formal credentials mattered less than demonstrated ability and willingness to learn. Oscar Wisting had come recommended by Prestrud. He was a naval gunner with no particular specialization in polar work, but he had a quality Amundsen valued highly: versatility. Wisting could turn his hand to virtually any task. More crucially, he developed what Amundsen called the way of his own with the sledge dogs. Without formal training, Wisting seemed to instinctively understand dog psychology and quickly became one of the expedition's most skilled mushers. Amundsen also noted that Wisting proved to be an excellent amateur veterinarian, able to diagnose and treat minor injuries and illnesses in the dogs before they became serious problems. Sverre Hassel was an expert on dogs, a veteran of Otto Sverdrup's 4-year Fram expedition to the Canadian Arctic. He had not initially planned to go all the way to Antarctica, intending only to accompany the expedition as far as San Francisco. But Amundsen valued his expertise too highly to let him leave. Hassel knew dogs the way a master craftsman knows his tools. He understood their individual temperaments, their strengths and weaknesses, how to motivate them, when to push them, and when to rest them. This knowledge would prove invaluable when the expedition's success depended entirely on the performance of the dog teams. Perhaps no member of the expedition embodied the combination of skills Amundsen sought more perfectly than Olav Bjaaland. He came from Morgedal in the Telemark region of Norway, the birthplace of modern skiing techniques. Morgedal was where Sundre Norheim had revolutionized skiing in the mid-1800s, and its residents were still considered the finest skiers in Norway. Bjaaland had won the Nordic Combined at the prestigious Holmenkollen Ski Festival in 1902, competing against the best Nordic skiers in the world. He could ski faster and with more endurance than any other man on the expedition. But Bjaaland's skills extended beyond athletics. He was a master carpenter who understood wood, stress, weight distribution, and structural integrity. Amundsen knew that the sledges would need modification during the winter preparation period. Store-bought sledges, even well-made ones, were designed for general use. For the specific demands of an Antarctic sledge journey, they would need to be lighter, stronger, and more efficient. Bjelland was the man who could make those modifications without compromising the sledge's ability to withstand the brutal conditions they would face. Helmer Hansen occupied a special place in Amundsen's plans. He had served with Amundsen on the Gojo expedition through the Northwest Passage, where he had learned from the Inuit how to drive dog teams. Hansen was not merely competent with dogs, he was an artist. He understood the relationship between musher and team, the subtle communications of voice and body language that made the difference between dogs who merely obeyed and dogs who performed with enthusiasm. More importantly, Hansen had proven himself as a navigator. On the polar journey, he would be responsible for carrying the expedition's master compass on his sledge, and his navigation skills would be crucial to keeping them on course across the featureless ice. Jorgen Stubberud was the expedition's carpenter who had built the prefabricated hut that would serve as their winter quarters. He had constructed it in sections in Norway, then disassembled it for shipping. Stubberud understood that the hut had to withstand Antarctic winds that could reach hurricane force, temperatures that could plummet below -50°C, and the psychological weight of housing 9 men in close quarters through the 4 months of polar night. When he finished construction and asked to join the expedition rather than return to Norway with Fram, Amundsen agreed. Stubberud's practical skills and steady temperament made him valuable. The expedition's cook, Adolf Lindström, was another veteran of polar work, having served with both Sverdrup and on Gojo with Amundsen. He understood that in the polar regions, food was not merely sustenance but also comfort, routine, and a psychological anchor. A good cook could maintain morale when darkness, cold, and isolation wore away at men's spirits. Lindström knew how to prepare seal meat in ways that made it palatable, how to ration supplies to provide variety without waste, and how to create a welcoming atmosphere at mealtimes that gave the crew something to look forward to. These were the core members of the shore party, each selected for specific skills but also for temperament. Amundsen needed men who would not crack under pressure, who would not let small disputes escalate into major conflicts during the long winter, who would maintain discipline and purpose even when the goal seemed impossibly far away. There was, however, one member of the expedition whom Amundsen had not personally chosen, Hjalmar Johansen. Johansen was a Norwegian legend, a hero from Fridtjof Nansen's Fram expedition of the 1890s. When Nansen had attempted to reach the North Pole by skiing across the ice, Johansen had accompanied him on that epic journey. Together they had survived a winter alone on Franz Josef Land, living in a stone hut and hunting walrus, after being unable to return to Fram. It was one of the great survival stories in polar exploration, and Johansen's name was forever linked with Nansen's in Norwegian history. But that had been nearly 2 decades earlier. In the years since, Johansen had struggled to adjust to normal life. Depression, alcoholism, and debt had followed him. Multiple people, including Nansen himself, had tried to help Johansen restart his life, but nothing seemed to work. When Nansen asked Amundsen to give Johansen a place on the expedition, Amundsen felt he could not refuse his mentor and benefactor. But he had serious reservations. Johansen was older than the other men, his physical condition was questionable after years of hard living, and his psychological state was uncertain. Still, Amundsen included him, hoping that the structure and purpose of an expedition might help Johansen reclaim something of his former self. It was an act of compassion, but also a potential vulnerability. The dynamics between Johansen, who had accomplished more in polar exploration than any other member of the expedition except Amundsen himself, and the younger men who lacked his experience but did not share his personal demons, would prove to be a source of tension. The final shore party of 9 represented a cross-section of Norwegian society and expertise. They were not all friends, not all from the same social class or background. What united them was Amundsen's belief that they possessed the skills, strength, and mental fortitude to succeed where others had failed. As Fram sailed south through the Atlantic after leaving Madeira, the crew still believed they were heading to the Arctic via Cape Horn. Amundsen had maintained his secrecy brilliantly, deflecting questions, keeping his true plans known only to Nilsen and his brother Leon back in Norway. The men noticed oddities in their preparations that did not quite fit an Arctic expedition, but they trusted Amundsen enough not to press too hard for explanations. On September 9, 1910, Amundsen finally gathered the crew and told them the truth. They were not going to the North Pole. They were going to Antarctica. They were going to race Robert Falcon Scott to the South Pole. Each man was given the choice to continue or to leave the expedition in South America. Not a single man chose to leave. It was a testament to Amundsen's leadership and the confidence he had built in his crew that this revelation, which could have caused mutiny or mass desertion, instead strengthened their resolve. They understood immediately what was at stake, both for the expedition and for Norway as a young, independent nation seeking its place in the world. They were no longer just crew members on an exploration vessel. They were participants in one of the great competitions of the age, and they were determined not to fail their leader or their country. Before leaving Madeira, Amundsen sent his famous telegram to Scott, "Beg leave to inform you from proceeding Antarctic." It was a masterstroke of timing. By the time Scott received the message in Melbourne, Fram would already be well on her way south, impossible to intercept. Scott could do nothing but continue with his own plans and hope that British resources and determination would carry the day. The relationship between Amundsen and his crew during the ocean voyage was carefully balanced. He was not distant, but neither was he overly familiar. He ate with the men, participated in work aboard ship, and made himself available for questions and discussions. But there was never any doubt about who was in command. His experience, his track record of success, and his meticulous planning earned him a respect that went beyond mere rank. The men trusted him because he had proven himself worthy of that trust, not just through past accomplishments but through daily demonstrations of competence and judgment. As Fram crossed the equator and continued south, the crew prepared themselves psychologically for what lay ahead. They knew the basics of Antarctic conditions from Amundsen's descriptions, but none except Amundsen himself had experienced anything like what awaited them. They would be isolated for a year with no contact with the outside world, living in a hut on an ice shelf that might break off and drift away at any moment, preparing to journey into one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The strength of the team Amundsen had assembled would be tested not just during the journey to the pole, but during the long Antarctic winter of preparation. 9 men living in close quarters, working together every day, maintaining equipment, caring for nearly 100 dogs, all while darkness reigned outside and temperatures made even brief exposure potentially fatal. It would be a crucible that would reveal character, test friendships, and determine who would ultimately make the final push to the pole. Amundsen had chosen his men carefully, but human nature was unpredictable. Competence alone did not guarantee compatibility. Skills could be undermined by personality conflicts. And in the polar regions, where there was no escape from one another, where stress was constant and stakes were life and death, the tiniest friction could grow into serious problems. The expedition's success would depend not just on dogs and equipment and planning, but on the men themselves, on their ability to work together, support one another, and maintain purpose even when everything seemed impossible. Amundsen had done everything he could to assemble the right team. Now he could only hope that his judgment had been sound. Long before the men, the equipment, or the plans, there were the dogs. In Amundsen's conception of the expedition, the dogs were not merely transportation. They were not pack animals to be used and discarded. They were partners, essential elements of a system that would either succeed or fail based on their performance. Everything else, all the careful planning and selection of men and gear, would be worthless if the dogs could not do their job. Amundsen had learned about sledge dogs during his time with the Inuit on the Gojo expedition. He had watched Inuit hunters set out across sea ice with their teams, traveling distances that would have been impossible for men alone, hunting seal and polar bear in conditions that would kill unprotected humans in minutes. The dogs were not pets in the Western sense. They lived outside year-round, slept in snowdrifts, and were fed when they worked. But the relationship between musher and dog team was profound in its own way. The dogs gave the Inuit mobility and hunting capability that made life possible in the Arctic. In return, successful hunting meant food for the dogs as well as the humans. The breed Amundsen selected, known variously as Greenland dogs or Eskimos dogs, had been developed over thousands of years in the harshest conditions on Earth. DNA analysis would later show that these dogs descended from breeding stock that arrived in Greenland with the Thule people around 1000 CE, though their lineage traced back even further to sled dogs used in Siberia 9,500 years ago. They were not a breed in the modern sense, with a breed standard and kennel club registration, but rather a type, a working dog shaped by functional requirements and natural selection in an environment where weakness meant death. Their physical characteristics reflected this brutal culling. They stood 23 to 25 inches at the shoulder for males, slightly smaller for females, and weighed 60 to 80 pounds. This size represented an optimal balance, large enough to pull heavy loads and generate body heat, small enough to be efficient in food consumption and heat retention. Their heads were broad and wedge-shaped with small, triangular ears thick with fur to prevent frostbite. Their eyes were slightly tilted, though blue eyes or heterochromia were considered faults, as the pigmentation seemed linked to reduced tolerance for the extreme conditions. The coat was their most remarkable feature. They possessed a double coat consisting of a short, dense, wool-like underlayer and a longer, coarser, water-repellent outer layer. This combination provided extraordinary insulation. A Greenland dog could sleep comfortably in a snowdrift at -40 degrees Celsius, curled with its tail wrapped over its nose to warm the air it breathed. The coat came in all colors except white with colored patches or mole patterning. Many had a distinctive triangular patch on their shoulders called an ulo, named after a traditional Greenlandic woman's knife of similar shape. Their paws were broad and powerful, with webbed toes that acted like snowshoes, distributing their weight over a larger area and preventing them from breaking through snow crust as badly as narrow-pawed dogs would. The pads were tough and thickened, resistant to cuts from ice and prolonged contact with frozen surfaces. Their tails, typically carried curled over the back, served a vital function beyond balance and communication. When sleeping in extreme cold, a dog would curl tightly and wrap its tail over its nose, warming the air it breathed and protecting its face from frostbite. Amundsen ordered 97 of these dogs from northern Greenland, specifically requesting the best specimens available. He knew that quality varied even within the breed, and for an expedition where lives would depend on the dog's performance, only the finest would do. The dogs arrived in Norway and were transported to Kristiansand, where they would board Fram for the journey south. Managing 97 dogs required specialized knowledge. They could not simply be chained and fed like domestic pets. They were semi-wild, pack animals with complex social hierarchies and behaviors that had to be understood and respected. Each dog had its own personality, strengths, and weaknesses. Some were natural leaders, dominant animals that other dogs instinctively followed. Others were excellent workers but poor fighters, capable of sustained effort but likely to be bullied by more aggressive pack members if not protected. Some were fast but lacked endurance. Others were slow but could pull heavier loads longer. Sverre Hassel, the expedition's dog expert, worked with each animal, learning its temperament and capabilities. He identified the lead dogs, the animals that would run at the front of the team, setting pace and direction. Lead dogs required intelligence, confidence, and the right combination of dominance and cooperation. They had to be smart enough to understand commands, confident enough to break trail through snow or navigate around obstacles, and socially adept enough that the dogs behind them would follow willingly. The harness system Amundsen planned to use was crucial. Unlike the tandem system favored by the British, where dogs were arranged in pairs pulling one behind another, Amundsen would use a fan hitch. In this arrangement, each dog had its own line of roughly equal length connecting to a central point at the front of the sledge. The dogs spread out in a fan shape, distributing the pull across a wider area and allowing each animal to find its own best path through broken ice or soft snow. If one dog fell into a crevasse, the others were far enough apart that they were unlikely to fall in as well. And the fan arrangement allowed natural leaders to emerge and set pace without artificial restraints of position. The fan hitch required skilled driving, though. The musher had to understand dog behavior, read the terrain, and make constant small adjustments to direction and pace. Commands were given by voice, not reins. The dogs learned to respond to calls of left and right in Norwegian, and to speed up or slow down based on the musher's tone. It was a system that required the dogs to think and adapt, not merely obey mechanically, and it made them more effective in unpredictable conditions. Feeding the dogs properly was another critical element. Amundsen had calculated that each dog would need approximately 1 pound of dried fish or pemmican per day during heavy work. This seemed like a modest amount, but with nearly 100 dogs, it represented a substantial weight of supplies. The dogs would also eat seal meat when available, and as the expedition progressed and the sledge loads lightened, the dogs themselves would provide food for both their remaining pack mates and the men. The dogs ate quickly and competitively. Food was not distributed from a communal bowl but thrown to each dog individually. Hassel and the other mushers learned each dog's position in the pack hierarchy and fed them accordingly. Dominant dogs would steal from weaker ones if given the chance, so the weaker animals had to be fed separately or protected during feeding. It was a constant management challenge, requiring vigilance and understanding of canine psychology. Health care for the dogs was primitive by modern standards but sufficient for the circumstances. Common problems included cracked paw pads from prolonged exposure to ice, minor cuts and abrasions, and occasionally fights between dogs that resulted in bites requiring attention. Oscar Wisting developed a talent for veterinary work, able to examine a dog and determine whether it was sick, injured, or simply tired and needing rest. He learned to treat cut paws with a mixture of tar and tallow that protected the wound while allowing the dog to continue working. He could identify early signs of illness and isolate affected animals before disease spread through the team. The dogs themselves were remarkably hardy. Unlike ponies, which suffered terribly in Antarctic cold and required elaborate arrangements for shelter and care, the dogs thrived. They preferred sleeping outside even when offered shelter. Their double coats and high metabolism kept them warm in temperatures that would kill most animals. They could work day after day with only brief rests, recovering quickly from exertion that would have exhausted other creatures. But they were not machines. They had good days and bad days, just as humans did. They could be motivated or discouraged, enthusiastic or reluctant. A good musher learned to read his team's mood and adjust accordingly. Pushing too hard led to injured or exhausted dogs. Being too lenient led to lazy performance. Finding the balance required experience, observation, and a certain intuitive understanding that could not be taught, only learned through time and attention. Amundsen observed all of this during the voyage south and during the initial months in Antarctica. He saw which men had the gift for working with dogs and which did not. He saw which dogs were genuinely valuable and which were merely adequate. He began mentally calculating which teams would make the final journey to the pole, which men would drive them, and how many dogs they would need for each stage of the expedition. The relationship between man and dog on a polar expedition was unlike anything in normal life. The dogs were tools, yes, but tools that breathed, felt, and responded to how they were treated. Cruelty produced poor performance. Care and respect, within the context of what was necessary for survival, produced dedication and effort that seemed almost to exceed physical possibility. The men who understood this became effective mushers. Those who saw the dogs only as animals to be used never quite succeeded in getting the best from their teams. As Fram approached Antarctica, the dogs sensed something was changing. The air grew colder, ice began to appear in the water, and the world took on a strangeness that even they, with no prior experience of these latitudes, seemed to recognize as different from anything they had known. They had been bred for cold and ice, but Greenland, harsh as it was not Antarctica. The dogs were about to face conditions that would test whether thousands of years of genetic selection and natural adaptation had prepared them for Earth's most extreme environment. Everything depended on them. All the careful planning, all the selection of equipment and supplies, all Amundsen's experience and knowledge would be worthless if the dogs failed. They were the irreplaceable element, the one thing that could not be substituted or compensated for if it proved inadequate. Amundsen had staked everything on the belief that dogs were the key to reaching the pole. Now he would discover whether that belief was justified. The sledges that loaded onto Fram in Norway in the summer of 1910 were well-made examples of standard polar equipment, the same type that Robert Falcon Scott had purchased for his own expedition. They were constructed from Norwegian ash with steel shod runners, sturdy and reliable for general polar work. But Amundsen knew that adequate was not sufficient for what they would face. The difference between success and failure in Antarctica often came down to pounds saved, minutes gained, or strength reserves preserved. Every detail mattered. This is where Olav Bjaaland's skills became invaluable. During the long Antarctic winter, while darkness reigned outside and the men worked in their underground ice workshops, Bjaaland took apart the sledges with a craftsman's eye. He examined every joint, every brace, every component. Then he began the painstaking process of modification. Using a hand plane, Bjaaland shaved down the timber of the sledge frames and runners. Wood came away in long, translucent curls as he worked, hour after hour, day after day. He removed material from every part that could be thinned without compromising structural integrity. The work required intimate knowledge of wood grain, stress distribution, and the properties of ash under extreme cold. Remove too much and the sledge would crack under load. Remove too little and unnecessary weight would slow them down and exhaust dogs and men. When Bjaaland finished, he had reduced the weight of each sledge from 88 kilograms to just 22 kilograms, a savings of 66 kilograms per sledge without noticeably reducing its strength. This was extraordinary craftsmanship, the kind of work that can only be done by someone who understands materials at an intuitive level developed over years of practice. For an expedition that would use multiple sledges, the cumulative weight savings was enormous. Hundreds of pounds that did not have to be pulled across the ice, hundreds of pounds that could be replaced with extra food, fuel, or supplies, or simply left behind, making each day's journey faster and less exhausting. Bjaaland also constructed 3 entirely new sledges from spare hickory wood, designed specifically for the final stage of the journey across the polar plateau. These were even lighter than the modified sledges, intended for the last push where every ounce of weight reduction translated directly to speed and endurance. They were masterpieces of minimalist engineering, stripped of everything except what was absolutely necessary for function. The ski boots represented 2 years of evolution and testing. Amundsen had worked with manufacturers before the expedition, trying different designs, wearing them in various conditions, making notes on what worked and what failed. The final design incorporated multiple layers of insulation, using techniques adapted from Inuit footwear combined with European materials. The boots had to provide warmth in temperatures that could reach -60°C, protect against frostbite during long hours of skiing, and still allow enough flexibility for the complex movements of cross-country skiing. Each man was fitted with boots specifically sized and adjusted for his feet, a custom rarely observed in expeditions of the era. Extra boots were carried for each man, because boot failure could be a death sentence. If a man's feet froze due to inadequate footwear, he would be unable to continue. In the middle of the Antarctic plateau, hundreds of miles from any help, this would doom not only that man but potentially the entire expedition. The British would discover this lesson tragically. One of Scott's party, Edgar Evans, suffered a severe foot injury that contributed to his death, and Lawrence Oates's frostbitten feet became gangrenous, eventually leading him to walk out into a blizzard to his death rather than slow his companions. Amundsen's men experienced no serious foot problems during the entire expedition, a testament to the quality of their footwear and the care with which it had been designed. It was a small detail that made an enormous difference. The tents were another innovation. Traditional polar tents were white, made from canvas, and required multiple poles to support their structures. They were heavy, difficult to pitch in strong winds, and the white fabric provided no visual contrast against the snow, making a tent difficult to see from even a modest distance. Amundsen's tents addressed all these problems. They were dyed black using a process that maintained the fabric's strength while giving it a dark color. The black absorbed solar radiation, providing slightly more warmth inside, and stood out starkly against white snow, visible from miles away if someone became separated from the group. The single-pole design meant the pole could be lashed to the sledge during travel, requiring no assembly when making camp. The pole would simply be placed upright, the tent pulled over it, and the edges stayed down. 2 men could pitch the tent in minutes even in a storm. Most revolutionary was the sewn-in floor. Traditional tents had separate ground cloths that had to be arranged inside after the tent was pitched, a miserable task in extreme cold that exposed hands to frostbite risk. Amundsen's tents had floors permanently attached to the tent body, creating an enclosed space that kept out wind-driven snow and retained heat more effectively. The men could enter, close the tent, and have an immediate protected space. The cooking equipment had also been carefully selected. Amundsen chose primer stoves, Swedish-made devices that burned kerosene efficiently and could be operated with gloved hands. Each sledge carried a stove, a pot for melting snow into water, and containers for food. The design had been tested in the Arctic and proven reliable in extreme cold. The stoves were light, compact, and robust, exactly what was needed for cooking 3 meals a day in conditions where a fuel supply failure would be catastrophic. Food containers were specially designed wooden boxes that fitted precisely on the sledges and could be opened without removing gloves. This attention to detail extended to how food was packed. Everything had been calculated: the weight of each day's ration, the distribution between men and dogs, the balance of protein, fat, and carbohydrates needed to maintain strength during hard physical labor in severe cold. Nothing was left to chance or estimation. The pemmican was perhaps the most carefully designed element of the food supply. Amundsen had researched pemmican composition extensively and worked with manufacturers to create a special blend. The base was dried meat, usually beef or reindeer, ground to a powder. This was mixed with rendered fat, usually seal or beef tallow, in approximately equal proportions by weight. To this Amundsen added dried vegetables, oatmeal, and peas, creating a more complete nutritional profile than traditional pemmican. The result was a food that packed extraordinary calories into minimal weight and volume. A pound of pemmican provided over 2,000 calories, with high protein content and the fat necessary for generating body heat in extreme cold. It did not freeze solid even at Antarctic temperatures, and it could be eaten as is or cooked into a hot stew. While it was not particularly delicious by the standards of conventional cuisine, it was palatable and nutritious, and most importantly, it worked. Men could sustain themselves on pemmican supplemented with biscuits, chocolate, and occasional fresh seal or dog meat indefinitely. The navigation instruments were equally critical. Helmer Hansen would carry the expedition's master compass on his sledge, and this compass had to be reliable despite the cold, the bumping and jarring of sledge travel, and the proximity to the magnetic pole that could cause erratic readings. Backup compasses were carried by other members of the party. They also brought sextants for taking solar observations to determine latitude and longitude, artificial horizons for sextant readings when the natural horizon was obscured, chronometers for precise timekeeping necessary for celestial navigation, and charts of the stars for night navigation, though in the Antarctic summer they would experience 24-hour daylight. The sledges themselves, even after Bjelland's modifications, represented sophisticated engineering. The runners were shod with steel that could be polished smooth for reduced friction on ice and snow. The sledge bodies were designed to flex slightly rather than remaining rigid, allowing them to handle rough terrain without breaking. Lashing points were reinforced to withstand the stress of loads being distributed unevenly when crossing rough ice or crevassed areas. Each sledge was assigned to a specific team of dogs, and the mushers learned the characteristics of their sledges, how they handled, where they tended to bind or stick, what loads they could safely carry. This familiarity would prove crucial when making quick decisions during the journey, when knowing exactly how much your sledge and team could handle might mean the difference between pushing forward and needing to make an extra depot run. The clothing system deserved particular attention. Amundsen had rejected the British approach of using wool and cotton in favor of fur and skin. The sealskin suits from northern Greenland were virtually windproof, water-resistant even when damp from body moisture, and provided excellent insulation. They were heavy when first put on, but as the expedition progressed and physical condition improved, the men adapted to the weight. Under the sealskin suits were layers of reindeer fur clothing fashioned after traditional Inuit patterns. The fur trapped air in its structure, creating insulation that worked even when damp. Over everything, for particularly cold days or when stopped for extended periods, were outer garments of Burberry fabric or gabardine, treated to be windproof and water-resistant. The men wore mittens rather than gloves, with an outer layer of sealskin and an inner layer of wool or fur. This system kept hands warm but made fine manipulation of objects difficult. Practice was required to learn how to handle ski poles, manage dog harnesses, and perform camp chores while wearing bulky mittens. Some tasks required briefly exposing hands to the cold, and the men learned to work quickly, accomplish what was needed, and get their hands back into mittens before frostbite could set in. Footwear consisted of the special boot supplemented with fur socks and extra layers depending on temperature. The goal was to keep feet warm without overheating them, which would cause sweating that would freeze when motion stopped. It was a delicate balance, adjusted continuously based on activity level and ambient temperature. The goggles were critical for preventing snow blindness, a painful condition caused by ultraviolet radiation reflecting off snow and ice. Even on overcast days, the glare from snow could damage unprotected eyes. Amundsen brought multiple types of goggles, including traditional wooden snow goggles based on Inuit designs, which had narrow slits that limited light entering the eye while still allowing vision. These were supplemented with modern glass goggles with dark lenses, though these had a tendency to fog up from breath condensation. Every piece of equipment had been thought through, tested, and selected for reliability and functionality. Nothing was brought because it was traditional or because it looked good or because it was what previous expeditions had used. Everything was evaluated solely on whether it would work in the specific conditions of Antarctica, and whether something better might exist. This obsessive attention to equipment detail was not an affectation or mere perfectionism. It was survival. In the polar regions, equipment failure could mean death, and death did not come slowly. A man whose sleeping bag fails in -50-degree temperatures will be dead within hours. A broken sledge 200 miles from base could doom an entire party. A stove that won't light means no melted water, and without water, dehydration kills within days even in extreme cold. Amundsen understood that the margin between success and disaster was small. Everything had to work, all the time, in conditions designed by nature to break both machines and men. The equipment was not just tools, it was the thin shell of protection that stood between the expedition and oblivion. It had to be perfect, because imperfection was fatal. By the time the Antarctic winter ended and spring sun began to return, every piece of equipment had been tested, modified if necessary, and tested again. The men knew their gear intimately. They knew how to repair damaged items, how to improvise solutions to problems, how to make the best use of what they had. This knowledge, this familiarity, would serve them well in the months ahead when they would depend on equipment working flawlessly in the harshest conditions on Earth. The stage was set. The men were ready. The dogs were strong. The equipment was as perfect as human ingenuity could make it. All that remained was to venture onto the ice and discover whether preparation alone could conquer the unconquerable. Fram pushed through the pack ice of the Ross Sea on January 11, 1911, her reinforced hull groaning but holding as she forced her way toward the Bay of Whales. From the deck, the men could see their first glimpses of the Ross ice shelf, a wall of ice rising 60 to 100 feet above the water, stretching east and west beyond the limits of visibility. It was a barrier unlike anything most of them had ever seen, a cliff face of solid ice that marked the edge of the Antarctic ice sheet where it flowed off the continent and onto the sea. The Bay of Whales was an indentation in this ice cliff, a natural harbor of sorts where the ice had formed a protected inlet. Captain Nilsson, navigating carefully, brought Fram into the bay on January 14th. Before them lay a landscape of absolute desolation, flat ice extending inland as far as they could see, occasional pressure ridges where ice had buckled and cracked, and beyond, toward the south, the faint suggestion of rising terrain that marked the beginning of the continental interior. Amundsen went ashore immediately to survey potential sites for their base camp. He walked across the barrier ice, testing its solidity, examining the formations, looking for any signs of instability that might justify Shackletow's concerns about the Bay of Whales breaking off and drifting to sea. What he found satisfied him. The ice here was thick, grounded on underwater shoals or perhaps actual seabed. It was not the freely floating ice shelf he had feared might prove unstable. This would serve. He selected a site about 2.5 miles from where Fram was anchored, on a promontory that offered good visibility in all directions and appeared well protected from the prevailing winds. They would call it Framheim, Fram's home, and it would be their base for the next year. Unloading began immediately. This was back-breaking work in temperatures that hovered around freezing, warm by Antarctic standards but still harsh for men working in wet conditions as ice and snow melted on the ship's deck. Everything had to be ferried from Fram to the building site, the prefabricated hut sections, the supplies, the equipment, and 97 Greenland dogs who were eager to be off the ship after months at sea. The dogs adapted to Antarctic conditions with remarkable ease. They had been cooped up during the ocean voyage, fed and exercised but confined. Now they were free to run on open ice, and they took to it with enthusiasm. The men observed that the dogs seemed more comfortable here than they had been anywhere since leaving Greenland. The cold did not bother them. The ice and snow were their natural element. Within days, they had established their pack hierarchies, marked territories around the camp, and settled into routines. Jørgen Stubberud supervised the construction of the hut. He had built it once before in Norway, so he knew how the pieces fit together. But assembling it here, on ice, in Antarctic conditions, presented new challenges. The ground was too hard for conventional anchoring, so they had to devise systems using ice screws and dead men, buried anchors that distributed load across larger areas of ice. The work had to be done carefully but quickly, as weather could change without warning. The hut that emerged was larger and more sophisticated than typical polar structures. It measured 13 feet by 26 feet, with walls and roof covered with insulation and multiple layers of material to retain heat. Inside, they constructed partitions to create different spaces, a common area for eating and socializing, sleeping quarters divided into small cubicles for privacy, a kitchen area where Lindstrom would reign, and storage spaces for equipment and supplies. But the real innovation was underground. Rather than storing supplies inside the crowded hut or outside where they would be buried by drifting snow, Amundsen had the men dig tunnels and chambers into the ice beneath the camp. These subterranean spaces remained at a constant temperature just below freezing, perfect for preserving food and protecting equipment from the extreme temperature variations on the surface. They dug a workshop where Bjaaland could modify sledges and repair equipment. They carved out a smithy where metalwork could be done. They created storage chambers for the thousands of pounds of supplies they had brought. Eventually, the tunnels extended out from the hut like the spokes of a wheel, creating an entire underground complex interconnected by passages carved from solid ice. The work was extraordinarily strenuous. The ice was dense and hard, requiring picks and saws and patient labor to excavate. But the men worked with purpose, understanding that this underground infrastructure would make their winter immeasurably more comfortable and their spring preparation more efficient. They could work in the tunnels protected from wind and the worst cold, with stable temperatures and no concern about weather conditions outside. Above ground, they built kennels for the dogs, though most of the animals preferred simply sleeping in snow burrows they dug for themselves. They established a routine for feeding seal meat when available, supplemented with dried fish. Hunting parties went out regularly onto the ice shelf and to the edge of the ice where seals could be found basking in the sun. The seals were easy to approach and kill, providing fresh meat not just for the dogs but for the men as well. Amundsen insisted that seal meat be a regular part of the human diet, remembering the lessons of Belgica about scurvy prevention. By late January, Framheim was established and functional. It was not luxurious, but it was secure, organized, and well-stocked. The men had quarters, workspace, storage, and a year's supply of food and fuel. The dogs were thriving. The sledges and equipment were being prepared and tested. Everything was proceeding according to plan. On February 15th, Fram departed. Captain Nilsson would take the ship north to Buenos Aires and then conduct oceanographic research in the Atlantic while the shore party wintered in Antarctica. It was a strange moment for the 9 men left behind, watching their only connection to the outside world steam away into the grey sea. They were now truly isolated, alone on an ice shelf at the bottom of the world, with no possibility of rescue or resupply for at least 10 months. The psychological impact of that isolation was substantial, though the men did not speak of it much. They were cut off from everything familiar, from Norway, from news, from families, from the simple comfort of knowing that help was available if needed. If something went catastrophically wrong, if someone became seriously ill or injured, if a fire destroyed the hut, if the ice broke off and drifted to sea, there was nothing anyone could do. They had only themselves, their supplies, and their abilities. But this isolation also brought focus. There were no distractions, no divided loyalties, no outside pressures. Their world had contracted to a small hut on an ice shelf and the single overriding purpose, to reach the South Pole before Scotland returned safely. Everything they did was in service of that goal. The first major task was depot laying. Amundsen knew from studying Shackletow's expedition that the British had suffered from inadequate supply depots. They had placed caches of food and fuel at intervals along their route, but these had been too far apart and not stocked sufficiently. Men and ponies had been forced to carry heavy loads for long stretches, exhausting both. Shackletow himself had nearly died of starvation and exhaustion on the return journey, saved only by encountering a depot sooner than expected. Amundsen was determined not to make the same mistake. His plan was to establish a chain of depots stretching south from Framheim at 80, 81, and 82 degrees south latitude, with the largest depot at 82 degrees. These depots would be stocked generously, with more supplies than the expedition should need, creating margins of safety. And they would be close enough together that the distances between them could be covered without exhausting men or dogs. Depot laying would be done before winter, during the Antarctic autumn when temperatures were still relatively moderate and sunlight still illuminated the landscape. It was risky to venture onto the barrier ice this early, as temperatures could plummet unpredictably and storms could arise with little warning. But it was also necessary. The supplies had to be positioned before winter darkness made travel impossible. The first depot journey departed Framheim on February 10, 1911, only days after Fram had departed. Amundsen led a party of 8 men, leaving only Lindström, the cook, to maintain the base camp. They took 3 sledges pulled by 18 dogs, loaded with over 750 pounds of supplies per sledge, mostly pemmican, biscuits, and kerosene for fuel. The first miles across the barrier ice were deceptive. The surface was relatively smooth, the weather mild by Antarctic standards. They made good time, averaging 15 to 20 miles per day, the dogs pulling enthusiastically. They marked their route every 8 miles with large snow cairns topped with black flags that would be visible for miles across the white landscape. These markers would be crucial for navigation on the return from the pole, when every ounce of energy would be precious and any deviation from the most direct route could be fatal. At 80 degrees south, they established their first depot. They dug a pit in the snow, lined it with wooden boards, and stacked supplies inside: pemmican, biscuits, kerosene in sealed containers, and other provisions. Then they built an enormous snow cairn over the depot, marking it with flags and bamboo poles that extended high above the surface. Even if snow drift partially buried the cairn, the poles would remain visible. They also extended lines of marker flags east and west from the depot for several miles, creating a safety net. If they came back slightly off course, they would encounter one of these marker lines and could follow it to the depot rather than missing it entirely. They continued south, establishing the 81-degree depot with the same careful marking and generous stocking. The 82-degree depot received the most supplies of all, over 7,500 pounds of food, fuel, and equipment. It was an insurance policy, a fallback position that gave them multiple options. If something went wrong during the polar journey, if they had to turn back, or if progress was slower than anticipated, the 82-degree depot contained enough to sustain them. The depot-laying journeys were not without incident. On one trip, temperatures dropped to -51 degrees Celsius, cold enough that exposed skin would freeze within seconds. Several dogs developed frostbite on their paws despite their natural resistance to cold. Christian Prestrud, one of the younger men, suffered frostbite on his heel when his boot failed to provide adequate insulation. It was a warning of how quickly things could go wrong, even for a well-prepared expedition with quality equipment. But they also learned from these early journeys. They refined their routines for making camp, how to position the tents for maximum wind protection, how to distribute loads on sledges for optimal balance, how to manage the dogs feeding and resting to maintain their strength without exhausting them. They practiced navigation, learning to read the subtle variations in snow surface and ice formations that could guide them even when visibility was poor. They tested equipment under real conditions and modified anything that proved inadequate. By the end of April, as autumn faded into the approach of winter, they had established 3 major depots and several smaller caches. They had transported tons of supplies out onto the barrier ice and positioned them exactly where they would be needed for the spring polar journey. It was an extraordinary logistical achievement, the sort of advanced preparation that simply was not possible in the Arctic with its broken sea ice and unpredictable conditions. This was one of Amundsen's great advantages over Scott. The Ross ice shelf provided a stable platform for establishing supply depots that would remain in place, undisturbed by tides or currents or breaking ice. In the Arctic, such depots would be impossible. The sea ice constantly moved and fractured. But here, on the Great Ice Barrier, supplies could be cached with confidence that they would remain exactly where placed. The men returned to Framheim exhausted but satisfied. They had done the hard, unglamorous work that would make the difference between success and failure. Those depots, marked carefully and stocked generously, were their lifeline to and from the pole. Without them, the journey would be impossible. With them, it became feasible. As winter closed in and the sun began its descent toward the horizon, not to rise again for 4 months, the men of the shore party settled into their routines at Framheim. The underground complex of tunnels and chambers became their primary workspace. Above ground, the Antarctic winter was a nightmare of cold and darkness. Temperatures dropped to -60°C and below. Wind could reach hurricane force. Stepping outside even briefly required full polar gear and carried risk of disorientation and frostbite. But underground, in the ice tunnels beneath their hut, temperatures remained relatively stable just below freezing. It was cold, yes, but manageable. The men could work in lighter clothing, focusing on the tasks that would prepare them for spring. Bjaaland spent countless hours in his workshop, refining the sledges to their final form. He removed ounces from components that would never be seen, shaving weight while maintaining strength. He constructed the 3 special lightweight sledges for the final stage of the polar journey. He tested joints and repairs under stress, making sure that nothing would fail when it mattered most. Hassel and Wisting worked with the dogs, maintaining their health through the long darkness. The dogs needed exercise even in winter, so the men took them out on short runs whenever weather permitted. They checked each animal regularly for health problems, treating minor issues before they became serious. They refined the team assignments, learning which dogs worked well together and which combinations produced friction and inefficiency. Hansen focused on navigation equipment, checking and rechecking the compasses, practicing with the sextants, calculating tables for celestial navigation. He and Amundsen discussed routes, contingency plans, what they would do if they encountered unexpected obstacles. They studied maps based on Shackletow's journey, noting where he had found smooth ice and where he had battled through pressure ridges and crevasse fields. The communal life in the hut required careful management. 9 men living in close quarters for months, with no escape from each other and no external distractions, could easily descend into conflict and misery. Amundsen, remembering the psychological breakdown he had witnessed on Belgica, maintained strict routines. Meals were at regular times. Work schedules were organized. Evenings were dedicated to leisure, reading, playing cards, listening to the gramophone, or simple conversation. Each man had his own sleeping cubicle, a small space where he could retreat for privacy. Sundays were rest days when possible, a break from the routine that gave everyone something to look forward to. Lindström prepared special meals on Sundays, using up some of their more exotic provisions to provide variety and celebration. Birthdays were marked. National holidays were observed. These rituals provided structure and meaning to time that might otherwise have become an undifferentiated blur of darkness and cold. But tensions existed nonetheless. Hjalmar Johansen, the famous polar veteran, was proving difficult. He drank heavily, though Amundsen had limited alcohol to prevent exactly this problem. He was often morose and withdrawn, dwelling on past glories rather than contributing to current efforts. There were arguments, though Amundsen tried to mediate and prevent them from escalating. The dynamic between Johansen and the younger men was complex. Johansen had accomplished more in polar exploration than any of them. He had survived what should have been a death sentence, living alone with Nansen through an Arctic winter in conditions that broke other men. But that had been 20 years ago, and Johansen had been unable to translate that experience into ongoing success. The younger men respected his past but were frustrated by his present behavior. Amundsen managed this carefully, giving Johansen responsibilities that used his experience without allowing him to undermine morale. But it was a persistent concern, a crack in the unity that Amundsen knew was essential for success. As winter wore on and the sun remained below the horizon day after day, the psychological strain grew. The darkness was oppressive, not just the absence of light but the knowledge that this was unnatural, that humans were not meant to live this way. Some men experienced depression, sudden mood changes, irritability. Amundsen watched carefully for signs of serious psychological breakdown and intervened when necessary, adjusting work assignments or simply talking with men who needed reassurance. The cold was another constant challenge. Even in the tunnels and hut, it was always present. Metal became painful to touch with bare skin. Moisture froze instantly. Breathing the air hurt if done too quickly. The men learned to move slowly, conserve energy, stay bundled. They learned to recognize the early warning signs of frostbite, numbness, whitening of skin, tingling that indicated circulation was being cut off. They looked after each other, checking each other's faces for frozen spots, making sure no one went outside alone where an accident or moment of disorientation could be fatal. And through it all, they worked. Every day, regardless of the weather or darkness or cold, they worked. They prepared equipment, maintained supplies, cared for dogs, refined plans. They had one purpose, and they pursued it with a focus that bordered on obsession. On September 8, 1911, with the sun newly returned and temperatures rising, Amundsen judged conditions suitable for an early start toward the pole. It was audacious, perhaps reckless, to leave this soon. The temperatures were still brutally cold, averaging -50 Celsius. But Amundsen was driven by the knowledge that somewhere on the Ross Ice Shelf, Robert Falcon Scott and his British expedition were preparing their own attempt. Every day gained was advantage. 8 men and 7 sledges with 86 dogs departed Framheim heading south. Only Lindström remained behind, as he had throughout the winter, maintaining the base camp. The plan was simple: race south while conditions held, reach the pole before Scott, and be back at Framheim by January when Fram was scheduled to return. For the first 2 days, they made excellent progress, covering nearly 20 miles each day and reaching the 80-degree depot without incident. The dogs pulled enthusiastically, the sledges ran smoothly, and the men were in high spirits. This was what they had prepared for all through the dark winter. This was their moment. But on the 3rd day, the weather turned. The temperature dropped to -56 Celsius, cold enough that exposed skin froze in seconds, that breath formed clouds of ice crystals, that metal became brittle and dangerous to handle. More ominously, Johansen and Prestrud, who had fallen behind the main party, failed to arrive at the planned camping site. Amundsen faced a terrible decision. Push on and hope the missing men would catch up? Turn back to search for them, losing time and risking the entire expedition? Or wait, burning through supplies while temperatures remained deadly? He chose to wait. They made camp and huddled in their tents while the wind howled outside and the cold crept in despite their best efforts. They could not generate enough heat to stay comfortable. The primer stoves fought to produce flame in air so cold that kerosene barely vaporized. They lay in their sleeping bags, waiting, worrying, wondering if Johansen and Prestrud were dying somewhere out on the ice. In fact, the 2 men had made their own camp only a few miles away, having realized they could not reach the main party before dark. They were cold, miserable, and angry at being left behind, but they were alive. When they rejoined the expedition the next day, the reunion was not joyful but tense. Johansen in particular was bitter, accusing Amundsen of poor leadership in not ensuring the party stayed together. the friction between Johansen and Amundsen came to a head. In front of the other men, Johansen challenged Amundsen's decisions, questioned his judgment, and made clear his view that the expedition was being mismanaged. For Amundsen, this was intolerable. Discipline and unity were essential. Public challenges to his authority could not be accepted. But the weather made the larger point. Conditions worsened over the next days rather than improving. Temperatures remained life-threatening. The dogs began to suffer despite their adaptation to cold. Several animals developed frostbite. The men were exhausted, cold penetrating through all their layers despite the quality of their gear. On September 12, Amundsen made the decision to retreat. They would return to Framheim, wait for true spring conditions, and start again. It was a humiliating admission of failure, particularly galling because they had to pass back through the depots they had established, supplies sitting there unused while they fled back to base with their tails between their legs. The return journey was a nightmare. The cold sapped strength and will. The dogs, sensing that they were heading back rather than forward into unknown territory, became difficult to manage. Equipment began to fail. A sledge runner cracked. A tent pole snapped. Small problems that would have been mere inconveniences in better conditions became serious threats. They stumbled back into Framheim on September 16, having been gone only 8 days and having made it only to the 80-degree depot before turning back. It was a catastrophic false start, a waste of effort and supplies and, most critically, of time. Every day that passed was a day that Scott might be using to advance toward the pole. The aftermath was tense and ugly. Johansen had made no secret of his belief that the false start was Amundsen's fault, that an experienced polar explorer would have read the conditions better and not departed too early. The younger men were divided, some agreeing privately that Amundsen had been too eager, others defending their leader and pointing out that Johansen's own behavior and slowness had contributed to the problems. Amundsen's response was decisive and ruthless. He removed Johansen from the polar party. When they made their second attempt, Johansen would not be among them. Instead, Johansen would lead a small expedition to King Edward VII Land, a region of Antarctica that remained unexplored, accompanied by Prestrud and Stubberud. It was ostensibly an honor, a chance to make genuine scientific contributions rather than merely racing to an arbitrary geographic point. But everyone understood it was a punishment and an exile. Johansen was devastated but had no choice but to accept. Arguing would only make things worse, and he had already undermined his position through his public challenges to Amundsen's leadership. The other men were shaken, seeing how quickly one of their number could be cast out. It was a reminder that Amundsen, for all his careful planning and consideration, was ultimately the expedition's dictator. His word was final, his decisions absolute. The false start also had practical consequences. They had used supplies, exhausted dogs, and burned time. The equipment would need to be checked and repaired. The dogs would need time to recover. The men needed rest. And psychologically, the failed attempt had dealt a blow to their confidence. They had thought they were ready, had believed their preparation was sufficient, and they had been proven wrong. But Amundsen learned from failure. He recognized that he had been too eager, that his competitive drive to beat Scott had pushed him to depart before conditions were truly suitable. Antarctic spring was not a date on the calendar but a condition that arrived when it arrived, not before. The sun's return did not guarantee warmth. The end of winter darkness did not mean the cold had broken. They would wait longer for the second attempt. They would not leave until temperatures were consistently above -40°C. They would move more carefully, ensure the party stayed together, and not allow eagerness to override judgment. Most importantly, Amundsen finalized his decision about who would make the polar journey. 8 men had gone on the false start. Only 5 would go on the real attempt. This smaller party would move faster, consume less supplies, and reduce the complexity of coordination. The five would be Amundsen himself, Hansen for his navigation skills, Wisting for his dog handling and versatility, Bjaaland for his skiing ability and carpentry skills, and Hassel for his dog expertise. It was a strong team, each man bringing specific skills while also being capable generalists who could handle multiple tasks. They had trained together, worked together through the winter, and proven their compatibility. More importantly, they were united in purpose and loyal to Amundsen despite the false start debacle. The men left behind, Lindström, Johansson, Prestrud, Stubberud, and the officers who would remain with Fram, accepted their assignments with varying degrees of grace. Some understood that 5 was the optimal number for the polar attempt. Others felt excluded and resentful. But discipline held. Whatever their private feelings, they would support the polar party's attempt. As October progressed and spring advanced, conditions improved. Temperatures rose into the -30s, then the -20s. The sun climbed higher each day, providing warmth and light. The dogs recovered their energy and enthusiasm. The men rested, repaired equipment, and prepared mentally for the second attempt. This time, there would be no false start. This time, they would reach the pole or die trying. The false start in September had been a lesson, expensive in time and morale but ultimately valuable. They knew now what true Antarctic cold could do. They knew the dangers of being too eager. They knew that the ice and cold and distance demanded respect, not bravado. When they departed Framheim for the second time, on October 19, 1911, there was no celebration, no cheering, no sense of adventure. The mood was grimly determined. They had work to do, a goal to achieve, and a British expedition somewhere out on the ice competing for the same prize. There was no room for error, no second chances, no rescue if things went wrong. The dogs sensed the change in their handler's mood. They pulled steadily, efficiently, without the wild enthusiasm of the first departure. The sledges followed tracks from previous depot-laying journeys, routes they had traveled before. The men moved with purpose but without haste, conserving energy for the long weeks ahead. The second departure from Framheim was quiet, almost anticlimactic. There were no crowds, no fanfare, no speeches. 5 men, for sledges, and 52 dogs simply set out across the ice barrier heading south, following the tracks and cairns that marked their previous depot-laying routes. It was October 19, 1911, and the weather was perfect, clear skies, light wind, temperature around -20 Celsius. Cold but manageable, bright but not glaring. The first days retraced familiar ground. They passed the 80-degree depot on October 23, resupplied from its stores, and continued south. The routine of travel had already been established through their practice runs: rise early, cook breakfast, break camp, travel in several shifts with brief rests, make evening camp, cook dinner, sleep, repeat. It was monotonous but purposeful, eating up the miles steadily without exhausting men or dogs. Each man had specific responsibilities that rotated on a schedule to maintain variety and ensure everyone stayed practiced at all tasks. One would serve as lead navigator, setting course and maintaining their bearing. Others would manage their dog teams, constantly adjusting to conditions and individual dog behavior. Someone would break trail when necessary, skiing ahead to test snow conditions and find the best route. In camp, tasks were divided: erecting tents, cooking, feeding dogs, recording weather and position in the expedition journal. The dogs pulled with steady determination, each team developing its own character. Wisting's team was fast but sometimes difficult, requiring constant attention to keep them focused. Hansen's team was reliable, plugging along at a consistent pace hour after hour. Hassel's dogs were the strongest pullers but also the most aggressive, requiring careful management to prevent fights. Bjelland's team was a mix of young and old dogs, energetic but sometimes unpredictable. By November 3rd, they reached the 82-degree depot, the southernmost of their major caches. They rested here for 2 days, allowing the dogs to recover and building their own strength for the unknown terrain ahead. South of this point, they would be venturing into territory no human had ever seen. Shackleton had approached the pole from a different direction, climbing the Beardmore Glacier far to the west. Amundsen's route, chosen for its shorter distance from the Bay of Whales, was completely unexplored. They reorganized their loads at the 82-degree depot, taking on supplies for the journey ahead and leaving behind everything non-essential. The sledges were repacked with scientific precision, heavier items low and toward the front, lighter items higher and toward the back, weight distributed to optimize balance and reduce friction. Every pound mattered now. Unnecessary weight meant slower progress, more strain on dogs, more food consumed to cover the same distance. From November 5th onward, they were breaking new trail across the ice barrier. The surface conditions varied unpredictably, sometimes hard-packed snow that the sledges glided across easily, sometimes soft powder that provided no support and required immense effort to plow through, sometimes icy crust with hidden soft snow beneath that would collapse under weight. Reading the surface became an art, learning to judge by subtle color variations and texture whether the snow ahead would bear weight or give way. They encountered their first serious obstacle on November 10th, the Devil's Ballroom, as they would name it. The surface here looked solid but was actually a thin crust over hidden crevasses. The dogs broke through repeatedly, falling into voids sometimes 30 or 40 feet deep, saved only by their harnesses which held them suspended while the men frantically pulled them back to safety. It was terrifying, exhausting work, never knowing if the next step would plunge man or dog into an abyss. They navigated through the Devil's Ballroom by spreading out, reducing weight concentration, and moving slowly, testing each step. It took the better part of a day to cross a stretch less than a mile wide, every man keenly aware that a mistake could be fatal. But they made it through without losing a single dog or man, though several dogs had narrow escapes and everyone's nerves were frayed. Beyond the Devil's Ballroom, the ice barrier began to give way to rising terrain. They were approaching the Trans-Antarctic Mountains, the range that separated the Ross Ice Shelf from the polar plateau beyond. Somewhere ahead lay the route they would have to find to climb from sea level to the 10,000-foot elevation of the plateau. Shackleton had used the Beardmore Glacier, but that was 100 miles to their west. What lay on Amundsen's path remained unknown. On November 17th, at 85 degrees south, they encountered what they were looking for, a massive glacier ascending toward the south. It was unnamed, never before seen by human eyes, a river of ice miles wide flowing down from the mountains. They would call it the Axel Heiberg Glacier, after one of the expedition sponsors. The glacier presented both opportunity and danger. It offered a route up to the plateau, ascending more than 9,000 feet over approximately 40 miles. But glaciers were notoriously treacherous, riddled with crevasses, unstable ice formations, and avalanche dangers. The Beardmore Glacier had nearly killed Shackleton's party, and it was considered one of the more navigable options. They made a depot at the base of the glacier, leaving supplies they would need for the return journey. Then they began the ascent. The first day was encouraging. They climbed steadily, the dogs finding purchase on the icy surface and pulling the sledges up slopes that grew steeper as they ascended. The men helped when necessary, pushing sledges or pulling alongside the dogs on particularly difficult sections. But the terrain grew worse as they climbed. They entered a chaotic landscape of ice falls, pressure ridges, and crevasses that appeared without warning. Blue ice, hard as rock, alternated with areas of deep powder snow. The route twisted and turned, finding passage between obstacles that sometimes forced them to backtrack and search for alternative paths. On November 20th, they reached a section they would call the Devil's Glacier, where the ice had fractured into a nightmare landscape of blocks, towers, and chasms. Navigating through required constant vigilance. The dogs had to be led carefully, sometimes lifted bodily over obstacles or coaxed across ice bridges that spanned crevasses. The sledges had to be unlashed and repacked to fit through narrow passages, then reassembled on the other side. Progress slowed to a crawl, sometimes just a mile or two per day through the worst sections. The men were exhausted from the combination of thin air at altitude, physical labor of managing dogs and sledges through brutal terrain, and mental strain of constant awareness that one misstep could send them plunging to their deaths. But Bjelland's skills proved invaluable here. He could assess ice, determine the safest routes, identify weak spots that might collapse. His experience in Norwegian mountains, while different from Antarctic glacier, gave him an intuitive sense for snow and ice behavior. More than once, he spotted danger that others had missed, calling a halt just before someone would have stepped onto ice that would not have held. The dogs, remarkably, adapted to glacier travel better than the men had dared hope. They learned to sense weak ice and avoid it, to leap over small crevasses, to scramble up steep ice faces using their claws for grip. Several times, dogs fell into crevasses and had to be hauled back up, but they seemed to accept this as part of the work, shaking themselves off and continuing once rescued. By November 21st, after 4 days of climbing, they reached the top of the Axel Heiberg Glacier at 85 degrees 36 minutes south, 10,600 feet elevation. Before them stretched the polar plateau, a relatively flat expanse of snow and ice that extended, as far as they knew, all the way to the pole itself. They had climbed 9,000 feet, dragged tons of supplies up a glacier that had never felt human footsteps, and emerged onto the roof of Antarctica. They made camp at this location and faced the hardest decision of the journey. They had 52 dogs. The sledges were lighter now, having consumed supplies during the ascent. Simple mathematics showed they no longer needed so many dogs. In fact, keeping all 52 would mean using precious supplies to feed animals that were no longer necessary for pulling. Amundsen's plan from the beginning had been to reduce the dog team systematically as the need for pulling power diminished. The dogs would be killed, and their meat would feed both the remaining dogs and the men, providing fresh food that would prevent scurvy and supply necessary calories. It was pragmatic, even essential for survival. But it was also difficult, even for men who understood the necessity. The location at 85 degrees 36 minutes south would enter the expedition's records with a name both accurate and grim: the Butcher's Shop. Here, at the top of the Axel Heiberg Glacier on a relatively flat expanse of the polar plateau, Amundsen ordered the systematic killing of 24 dogs. The decision was logical, even necessary. They had started the glacier with 52 dogs and 4 heavily loaded sledges. Now, atop the plateau with supplies consumed during the climb, they needed only 3 sledges and the reduced pulling power that implied. The excess dogs served no purpose but to consume food supplies that were calculated down to the last pound. In the harsh arithmetic of polar survival, keeping unnecessary dogs was wasteful and potentially fatal. But logic did not make the task pleasant. These were not just animals but partners who had pulled faithfully for weeks, who had worked through cold and exhaustion, who had trusted their human handlers and performed beyond what might reasonably have been asked. The dogs did not understand calculations about supplies and distances. They only knew they had done their work and done it well. The men selected the dogs to be killed with care. They chose primarily the weakest animals, those who had developed lameness or other problems that would slow them down on the plateau. They also selected dogs that had not worked well in harness, who had caused friction within their teams or required disproportionate attention from the mushers. The strongest, healthiest, and most reliable dogs would continue. Hassel and Wisting handled the actual killing, using a rifle to shoot each dog cleanly through the head. It was quick and, as far as the dogs were concerned, unexpected. One moment a dog was alive, the next it was not. There was no suffering, no drawn-out death, just the sharp crack of a rifle and stillness. The butchering that followed was practical and efficient. In temperatures well below freezing, the carcasses did not decay. They were skinned and sectioned, the meat cut into portions that could be fed to the remaining dogs and the men. The dog meat would supplement their pemmican rations, providing fresh protein and the vitamins that prevented scurvy. It was not a delicacy by any standard, tough and with a flavor that took some getting used to, but it was nutritious and necessary. The remaining 28 dogs were fed immediately with some of this fresh meat. They ate with their usual gusto, showing no sentiment about the sauce. Dog packs do not mourn their members, they simply accept the hierarchy and reality of life. The humans were more conflicted, but they ate as well, understanding that revulsion was a luxury they could not afford. One sledge was abandoned at the butcher's shop along with various supplies and equipment no longer needed. They built a large depot, marking it carefully with flags and cairns, knowing they would return this way and need to find these supplies. The 3 remaining sledges were repacked and balanced for the teams that would pull them. When they departed the butcher's shop on November 26th, the expedition was leaner, harder, more focused. They were 5 men, 3 sledges, 18 dogs, heading south into unknown territory with precisely calculated supplies and no margin for significant error. Everything excess had been stripped away. What remained was the bare minimum needed to reach the pole and return to this depot. The polar plateau stretched before them, a landscape of such subtle monotony that it challenged sanity. There were no landmarks, no features to provide scale or reference. The surface was white, the sky was white, and the horizon where they met was often indistinct. Distances became impossible to judge. Objects that seemed close proved to be miles away. Depressions and rises in the terrain vanished in the flat light, appearing only when they were immediately underfoot. Navigation became critical and extraordinarily difficult. They were traveling toward the geographic South Pole, which was essentially arbitrary from a visual standpoint. There was nothing at the pole itself to mark it except numbers on navigation instruments. They had to maintain precise direction using compass bearings and regular astronomical observations with the sextant to determine their latitude and longitude. Helmer Hansen carried the expedition's master compass on his sledge and served as primary navigator. Multiple times per day, he would check their bearing, ensuring they were maintaining their southern course. When the sun was at appropriate positions, they would stop and Amundsen or Hansen would use the sextant with an artificial horizon to calculate their exact latitude. These observations were crucial. Even a small error in navigation could cause them to miss the pole entirely or waste precious supplies traveling extra distance. The weather on the plateau was bizarre and unforgiving. Temperatures ranged from -20 to -40 Celsius, cold but not as severe as they had experienced during the false start. But the winds could arise suddenly, creating white oak conditions where visibility dropped to a few feet. The sun circled overhead in a constant spiral, never setting, which made judging time difficult and disrupted sleep patterns. The men found themselves tired at odd times and alert when they should be resting. The psychological impact of the plateau was substantial. Day after day, they saw the same endless white in every direction. They would travel for hours, covering 10 or 12 or 15 miles, and the landscape would look exactly the same as when they started. There was no sense of progress, no visual confirmation that they were actually moving forward. Only the numbers from navigation observations provided proof that they were getting closer to their goal. The dogs felt it too. Their enthusiasm waned on the plateau. They pulled, because pulling was what they did, but the eager energy of earlier stages faded into mechanical routine. The mushers had to encourage them constantly, calling out commands and praise to keep them motivated. When they stopped for rests, the dogs would curl up immediately, conserving energy, not bothering to explore or play as they had in earlier camps. On November 27th, they passed 86 degrees south, farther south than any human except Shackletow's party had reached. From here on, every step was into territory never before trodden by human feet. They were pioneers, though the unchanging landscape offered no acknowledgement of that fact. They established depots every degree of latitude, marking them carefully and leaving supplies for the return journey. At 87 degrees south on December 3rd, they left another cache. At 88 degrees south on December 6th, they established what they called the last depot, containing everything they could afford to leave. From here to the pole and back to this point, they would travel with minimal supplies, every ounce of weight reduction translating to faster progress and less strain. On December 7th, they passed Shackletow's farthest south point, 88 degrees 23 minutes. Beyond this, they were truly in unexplored territory, farther south than any human had ever been. It should have been a moment of celebration, but the mood remained grimly determined. The pole was the goal, not intermediate records. The dogs were showing signs of the prolonged effort. Several were limping, their paws damaged by the abrasive ice crystals despite their natural toughness. Bjelland fashioned small boots from canvas and leather scraps to protect the most affected dogs' paws. It was improvised veterinary care, but it worked well enough to keep the dogs functional. The men themselves were holding up remarkably well, thanks largely to the fresh dog meat they had been eating. Scurvy, which had devastated other expeditions at this stage, showed no signs of appearing. They were tired, certainly, worn down by cold and effort and altitude, but they were fundamentally healthy and still capable of the work required. December 8th brought a strange gift. They reached what they calculated to be the point where the British expedition should be crossing their path if Scott was using Shackletow's route up the Beardmore Glacier. But there was no sign of the British, no tracks, no cairns, nothing. Either Scott had not yet reached this latitude, or he was on a slightly different track, or something had gone wrong with his expedition. Amundsen did not speculate publicly, but privately he must have allowed himself to hope that the British were behind, that his gamble on the shorter route and earlier start was paying off. On December 9th, they crossed 89 degrees south. The pole was less than 70 miles away. They could reach it in 3 days if weather and conditions held. But Amundsen was taking no chances. They traveled carefully, maintained full observation routines, kept the dogs as fresh as possible. This close to success, disaster could still strike. Ice could give way. Weather could trap them. Navigation error could send them past the pole without realizing it. The altitude was affecting them now, even though the plateau was only at about 10,000 feet. Antarctic air is thinner than air at the same altitude elsewhere due to the cold and high atmospheric pressure patterns. They were breathing hard during physical exertion, recovering more slowly from effort. Sleep was fitful, interrupted by headaches and a sensation of oxygen hunger that woke them repeatedly through their rest periods. But they pushed on. December 10th, December 11th, December 12th, each day bringing them closer to the mathematical point that represented their goal. The landscape never changed. The horizon never offered any indication that something significant was approaching. It was just ice and more snow, under a sun that circled endlessly in the sky. December 13th, 1911. The navigation calculations put them at 89 degrees 45 minutes south. 15 nautical miles from the South Pole. One good day's travel, perhaps 8 or 9 hours of steady movement, would bring them to their goal. The weather was clear, the temperature around -25 Celsius, and the snow surface was firm and fast. Conditions were as perfect as they were likely to get. The men rose early, though early was an arbitrary concept under the midnight sun. They cooked breakfast, fed the dogs, broke camp with practiced efficiency. The dogs seemed to sense something different about this day. They pulled with unusual eagerness, as if they too understood that this journey was approaching its climax. Hansen took navigational sightings repeatedly, checking their bearing against the sun's position and confirming their latitude with sextant observations. They were on course, moving directly south, closing the distance to 90 degrees south latitude with every step. The sledges glided across the snow. The dog's breath formed clouds that drifted behind them. The men skied alongside the sledges, their poles pushing in rhythm, an almost meditative repetition that had become second nature after weeks of travel. There was no conversation. Words were unnecessary and wasted breath. At approximately 3 p.m. on December 14th, Hansen's observations indicated they had reached 90 degrees south latitude. The South Pole. The bottom of the world. The point where all longitude lines converged, where every direction pointed north, where the Earth's axis of rotation intersected its surface. There was no marker, no indication that anything special existed at this location. It looked exactly like every other piece of the polar plateau they had crossed for the past 3 weeks. Just snow, ice, and the pale blue sky above. But the numbers confirmed it. They were there. Amundsen's account would later describe the moment with characteristic Norwegian understatement. They planted the Norwegian flag, a silk banner they had brought for this purpose. Amundsen held one corner, and each of the other 4 men held a corner as well. Together, all 5, they pushed the staff into the snow. It was a gesture of shared achievement. They had done this together, and together they would claim the honor. They made camp at the pole. Not because they needed to rest, but because Amundsen was thorough. They had to confirm their position beyond any possible doubt. Over the next 2 days, they conducted a series of astronomical observations, taking readings at different times to account for the sun's movement and using multiple instruments to cross-check results. They also skied out in different directions from what they calculated to be the pole, marking a large area to ensure that they had actually encompassed the true mathematical point rather than missing it by a narrow margin. This precision mattered because Amundsen knew the British would come eventually. Scott might arrive days or weeks after them, but he would arrive. And when he did, there had to be incontrovertible proof that the Norwegians had been there first. If there was any doubt, any argument that the Norwegians had missed the actual pole, it would taint their achievement. So they measured and calculated and observed. They erected a small tent at what they determined to be the exact pole, leaving inside it a letter addressed to the King of Norway and a note for Scott, asking him to forward the letter in case something happened to the Norwegian party on the return journey. It was a gesture both practical and slightly morbid, acknowledgement that reaching the pole was only half the challenge. They still had to make it back. The weather at the pole was surprisingly mild by Antarctic standards. The temperature never dropped below -30°C during their stay, and the wind remained light. It was as if the continent, having tested them so severely on the approach, was granting them a brief respite now that they had achieved their goal. The dogs rested, ate, and seemed content. They had pulled faithfully for 2 months and 1,000 nautical miles from Framheim to the pole. They had crossed ice barriers, climbed glacier, and traversed the polar plateau. They had performed exactly as Amundsen had believed they would. His faith in dogs over ponies had been vindicated completely. On December 17th, they began the return journey. They had spent 3 days at the pole, conducting observations and making absolutely certain of their achievement. Now they had to race back before supplies ran out or weather trapped them. The return journey followed their outbound tracks, marked by the cairns and flags they had placed every few miles. This navigation aid was invaluable. In white oak conditions or when the surface had changed due to wind and new snowfall, the markers guided them along the route they knew rather than forcing them to navigate blind through potentially dangerous terrain. They traveled fast, covering 30 miles in some days, pushing hard to reach the depots before their current supplies ran completely out. The dogs, now heading toward home rather than away from it, seemed to have found new energy. They pulled eagerly, needing less encouragement from the mushers. At each depot, they resupplied, taking on the caches they had left during the outbound journey. The system worked perfectly. Every depot was where they had left it, every cache contained what they needed. The careful depot laying of the previous autumn, the meticulous marking and recording of positions, the generous stocking that had seemed excessive at the time, all of it proved its worth now. On December 21st, they reached the last depot at 88 degrees south. They restocked fully, loaded the sledges with supplies they had cached there, and continued north. The dogs were fed generously with seal meat from the depot, their first substantial meal in days. December 26th brought them to the butcher's shop at the top of the Axel Heiberg Glacier. They retrieved the supplies they had left, loaded one of the cached sledges back into service, and prepared for the descent of the glacier. Going down would be faster than climbing up had been, but also more dangerous. Gravity would help pull the sledges, but it would also make them harder to control on steep sections. The descent began on December 27th. Almost immediately, they encountered difficulties. The sledges wanted to slide out of control down the icy slopes. The dogs were pulled along, sometimes lifted off their feet by the momentum of the sledges behind them. The men had to use ropes to break the sledges, wrapping lines around their bodies and leaning back with all their strength to prevent runaway descents. Bjelland skied ahead, scouting the route and identifying dangers. Behind him, the sledges picked their way down carefully, the mushers constantly adjusting, braking, and sometimes having to detach dogs and lower sledges manually down particularly steep or dangerous sections. On December 30th, they were off the glacier and back on the ice barrier. The worst was behind them. Ahead lay familiar territory, marked routes, and depots positioned for their return. They were bone-weary, hungry despite their rations, and mentally exhausted from the constant alertness required on the glacier. But they were going to make it. January 6, 1912, they reached the 82-degree depot and resupplied fully. From here, it was just over 160 miles to Framheim. Barring disaster, they would be home in a week. The weather was cooperating, the dogs were holding up, and the men had found that strange second wind that comes when the end of an ordeal is finally in sight. They pushed hard, covering 30 miles or more each day. The ice barrier was the same featureless expanse it had been on the outbound journey, but now they welcomed its monotony. No surprises, no challenges, just steady progress northward toward the Bay of Whales and Framheim. On January 17th, they spotted a dark line on the northern horizon, the cliffs of the ice barrier that marked the edge of the shelf. They were almost home. The dogs seemed to sense it and pulled with enthusiasm they had not shown in weeks. That night, they made camp within sight of their goal. January 18th, 1912, they sledged into Framheim. Lindström, the cook who had remained alone at the base for 4 months, was there to greet them. He had kept the fires burning, maintained the supplies, and waited patiently for their return with the fatalism of a man who understood that polar expeditions sometimes did not return at all. They had been gone 99 days. They had traveled 1,860 miles on skis and sledges. They had reached the South Pole on December 14, 1911, and they had returned successfully without losing a single man. The achievement was extraordinary by any measure. They had accomplished what some claimed was impossible, a polar journey powered entirely by dogs, completed faster than predicted, with no fatalities and no serious injuries. Amundsen's planning, preparation, and understanding of polar conditions had been vindicated completely. But there was no celebration yet. They did not know what had happened to Robert Falcon Scott and the British expedition. For all they knew, Scott might have reached the pole shortly after them or might even have beaten them by taking a different route. The race was not truly won until they could communicate their success to the world. Fram was not scheduled to return to collect them until late January or early February. The men rested, ate, and recovered from their ordeal. Slowly, their strength returned. The dogs were given generous rations and allowed to rest. Equipment was stored and inventoried. The hut at Framheim, which had been their home for over a year, began to feel temporary as their thoughts turned to the journey home to Norway. The other party, Prestrud, Johansen, and Stubberud, returned from their exploration of King Edward VII Land on February 9th. They had made some useful surveys and observations but had not reached particularly far into that region due to difficult ice conditions. The reunion was cordial but not warm. Johansen and Amundsen barely spoke to each other, the rift between them unhealed. Fram arrived at the Bay of Whales on February 9th, right on schedule. The reunion with Captain Nilsson and the ship's crew was joyful. Stories were exchanged, news from the outside world was shared, and preparations began immediately for departure. They would leave Antarctica as soon as loading was complete and the ship was ready for the ocean voyage north. By March 7th, Fram had departed Antarctica with all expedition members aboard. Framheim was left behind, the hut still standing, supplies cached for any future expedition that might need them. The Bay of Whales would continue to exist for decades more before eventually breaking off and drifting to sea, but for now it stood as silent testimony to what had been accomplished there. The voyage north was long but uneventful. Fram was a slow ship, and they would not reach civilization until reaching Hobart, Tasmania in early March. There, finally, Amundsen could send telegrams announcing their success to the world. The response was mixed. Norway celebrated, of course. The young nation, independent only since 1905, had produced the first men to reach both poles, with Amundsen conquering the South Pole to match his earlier success with the Northwest Passage. It was a source of tremendous national pride. The international reaction was more complex. Many celebrated the achievement, recognizing the skill and preparation it represented. But others, particularly in Britain, felt that Amundsen's secrecy and his decision to compete with Scott without openly declaring his intentions had been unsporting and underhanded. The debate about exploration ethics would continue for years. For Amundsen himself, the South Pole represented both triumph and a certain emptiness. He had achieved his goal through superior planning and execution. But it was, in the end, just a point on a map. The real accomplishment was the journey itself, the demonstration that with proper preparation and respect for the environment, humans could survive and even thrive in Earth's harshest conditions. The expedition's true significance emerged only gradually as the details became known. Amundsen had not merely reached the South Pole first, he had done so with a level of efficiency and safety that made other expeditions look amateurish by comparison. Robert Falcon Scott's British expedition reached the South Pole on January 17, 1912, 34 days after Amundsen. Scott and his four companions found the Norwegian tent with its flag and the notes Amundsen had left. The psychological blow of being second was devastating. But worse was to come. Scott's party died during the return journey, trapped by blizzards, exhausted, and suffering from scurvy. Their bodies would be found 8 months later, just 11 miles from a supply depot that might have saved them. The contrast between the two expeditions became the subject of intense study and debate. Both had faced the same environment and basic challenges. Yet one succeeded with almost casual efficiency while the other ended in tragedy and death. Why? The answer lay in the logistics, the preparation, and the core decisions about methods. Amundsen had chosen dogs as his primary transport, had learned from indigenous peoples who lived in similar climates, had tested his equipment rigorously, had established generous supply depots, and had maintained discipline and focus throughout. His expedition lost no men and returned ahead of schedule. Scott had relied on a combination of motor sledges that broke down almost immediately, ponies that suffered terribly in the cold and eventually died, and manhauling where the men themselves dragged sledges weighing hundreds of pounds. His supply depots were too far apart and insufficiently stocked. His clothing and equipment were based more on British naval tradition than on proven polar techniques. And his party suffered from poor diet that led to scurvy, inadequate shelter, and a series of decisions that compounded rather than mitigated risks. Amundsen's dogs had been the critical difference. Throughout the expedition, the dogs had performed consistently, requiring relatively modest food supplies and adapting well to Antarctic conditions. By using dogs, Amundsen's men had conserved their own strength for when it was most needed. They had not exhausted themselves pulling sledges for hours each day, and consequently, they had maintained the physical and mental reserves necessary to handle challenges when they arose. The ski boots, the tents with sewn-in floors, the lightweight sledges, the black fabric that absorbed heat and provided visual contrast, the primer stoves, the carefully formulated pemmican, the systematic depot laying, the navigation methods, the clothing adapted from Inuit designs, every detail had contributed to success. Failure to pay attention to any one of these details might not have been fatal on its own, but the cumulative effect of getting everything right created a system that was robust and resilient. Amundsen's leadership style also deserves recognition. He had been ruthless when necessary, removing Johansen from the Polar Party when discipline required it. But he had also been democratic in important ways, holding councils with his men to discuss plans and taking their opinions seriously. He had shared hardships rather than claiming special privileges. And he had made decisions based on logic and experience rather than on tradition or national pride. The expedition also demonstrated something about exploration philosophy. Scott's stated goal had been scientific observation and discovery, with the pole as a secondary objective. Amundsen's goal was explicitly to reach the pole first, with science being secondary. Yet Amundsen's party made substantial geographical discoveries, including the Axel Heiberg Glacier and the plateau route to the pole. They collected meteorological data throughout their journey. And they returned with all their observations intact and their observers alive to report them. Scott's party gathered scientific specimens until almost the end, but died with them, rendering much of that scientific effort moot. In the decades since, Amundsen's expedition has been studied by military organizations, adventure planners, and business strategists as a case study in preparation, risk management, and execution. The principles he demonstrated remain relevant beyond polar exploration: understand your environment, learn from those with experience, test your equipment rigorously, maintain generous safety margins, prepare for contingencies, and lead with both discipline and pragmatism. The dog teams, in particular, became legendary. Of the 52 dogs that started from Framheim toward the pole, and after the systematic culling along the way, 11 dogs returned to Framheim with the men. These survivors had pulled sledges across nearly 2,000 miles of ice and snow, climbing glacier and crossing the polar plateau. Several of these dogs were brought back to Norway and lived out their lives as celebrities, the canine heroes of polar exploration. The expedition's financial aspect also deserves mention. Amundsen had operated on a tight budget, much less than Scott's government-funded enterprise. Yet his efficiency meant he accomplished more with less. The expedition returned having spent approximately what was budgeted, with no lives lost and all major objectives achieved. It was, in business terms, an exceptional return on investment. Amundsen would go on to other accomplishments, including being part of the first expedition to cross the Arctic Ocean by air. But the South Pole journey remained his defining achievement, the expedition that demonstrated most clearly his philosophy and methods. When he died in 1928, disappearing while attempting to rescue another explorer in the Arctic, he was mourned as one of the greatest polar explorers in history. The hut at Framheim eventually was destroyed when the ice shelf it sat on broke off and drifted to sea, as Shackleton had feared. But before it vanished, it served as a shelter for other expeditions, a testament to Stubberud's construction skills. The depots Amundsen's party established were used by subsequent expeditions, including some of Scott's support teams who found them during search operations. The route Amundsen pioneered, up the Axel Heiberg Glacier and across the plateau, proved to be one of the better approaches to the pole. Modern Antarctic traverse vehicles still use variations of that route, finding it more practical than the Beardmore Glacier that Scott had used. But perhaps the most lasting legacy is the proof of concept Amundsen provided, that careful planning, appropriate technology, and respect for the environment can overcome challenges that defeat brute force and traditional approaches. The expedition succeeded not because the men were superhuman but because they were superbly prepared. That lesson remains relevant wherever humans venture into harsh environments or face complex challenges. As you reflect on this journey, as you consider what 5 men and their dog teams accomplished over those 99 days on the ice, remember that every great achievement begins with a plan, proceeds through preparation, and succeeds through execution. Amundsen and his men reached the South Pole because they earned it through months and years of work before they ever set foot on the ice barrier. The journey to the pole was, in many ways, the easy part. The real challenge was in the preparation. And so we close this chapter of human exploration, this tale of logistics and dogs and ice, of planning and perseverance, of a goal achieved through method rather than chance. The story of Amundsen's South Pole expedition reminds us that even in the harshest environments, even facing the most daunting challenges, careful thought and proper preparation can carry us through. If you have found value in this journey through history, I invite you once more to like this video, to subscribe for more explorations of human achievement and natural wonder, and to leave your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, may your own journeys, whatever they may be guided by preparation, wisdom, and respect for the challenges ahead. Thank you for listening, and good night.